I'm going to look at the poem Neutral Tones by Thomas Hardy, and this is part of the relationships unit in the Edexcel GCSE English Literature anthology. In this part of the exam, you need to compare two poems, one of which will be printed in the exam, but you won't know which one it is. It'll be one of the 15 you've studied, and you'll have to compare that linking with a certain theme, whatever the question asks you, with one other poem that you choose but that you haven't got in front of you. So you have to know the poems well enough in order to know a poem from memory pretty much in order to compare it to this one. You don't need to remember the whole poem in its entirety, but you need to know enough about enough of the poems in the anthology that you can remember key quotes, what they're about, key things about the author, etc., etc. So talking about key things about the author, Edexcel you do get marks for context in this part of the exam. Now what this means is Edexcel want you to know a certain amount about the poet's background and the historical kind of feeling of the time, what was happening socially, what was happening economically, what was happening in literature around that time, enough so that you can link it to their ideas within the poem. What they don't want you to do is do a paragraph all about Thomas Hardy, for example, but what they might want you to do is make some kind of link between anything you know about Hardy and the events of this poem, and similarly for the other poem that you compare it to. So it's important to have a little bit on context for each of the poems in the anthology. You don't need to say much, but even if you link it in a couple of places, you've satisfied that requirement of the mark scheme. It's always important to think about context when you read any work of literature. You need to know the kind of social conventions of the time. For example, if we're looking at something like relationships, which are very different from now, and so therefore might bring new insights into the way people speak to each other or behave towards each other in works of literature. So Thomas Hardy was a 19th century and early 20th century poet and novelist. And he was influenced by the Romantic movement, but he wasn't a romantic poet with a capital R, because that's talking about a specific time period. But you could call him definitely influenced by the Romantic movement, especially in the way he talks about nature. But he was also caught up in that end of the 19th century, early 20th century period, almost of modernism. He was quite forward thinking, especially in the way he thought about relationships and outside of marriage relationships as well. And so he was caught up in the social realism of such campaigning novelists like Charles Dickens, who are very concerned with poverty and the big divide between the upper classes and the lower classes in society. His novels, he was a novelist primarily, I would say, and they often focused on tragic characters in very tragic circumstances, often really criticising the social problems of Victorian England. And they tended to be problems of class, problems of money, and also problems of how sex and sexual relationships were frowned upon outside of marriage, and how women could be absolutely made destitute by just having a relationship outside of marriage. So he was quite modern in that way of being sympathetic towards that. His novels are quite depressing. Thinking Jude the Obscure, I mean, they're brilliant novels, but Jude the Obscure, halfway through, there's one big event that happens that I literally could not believe. Anyway, read it if you want to find out what that is. Tess the d'Urbervilles, great novels that you should read. But this is about his poetry, and one poem in particular. Many of his poems are also quite depressing. They deal with the theme of disappointment in life and in love. Neutral Tones is one of his best known early poems and was published in 1898. And it's about a love affair that's obviously gone wrong. And it's a memory, it's looking back on that love affair. He did write a lot of poems about his wife later, and his wife died, and after his wife's death he was very, very upset and wrote a lot of very sad poems, but they didn't have the greatest relationship. This is before he met his wife, I believe, so I don't think this poem is about his wife, but it obviously is some kind of love affair that went wrong. Okay, so thinking even about the title, Neutral Tones, what does this suggest? Well, the word neutral can be ambiguous, can't it? Because something neutral almost means a lack of feeling. It's no great peak of feeling, no great depth of feeling. It's all very ambivalent, all one kind of tone. You don't feel one way or the other about it. The word tones itself, you can think of, we say, what tone of voice is this? So it can mean an emotion or mood. So a neutral emotion, a state of absolute neutrality, ambivalence, almost boredom. Tones as well, though, can be colours, can't they? And more than a colour, which is just one thing, red, blue, green, a tone is a slight variation or shift. So it's talking about very many layers of meaning, and it's also got that musical symbolism as well, hasn't it? In the tones of music. So it's setting the scene with just those two words of the title. You should, if you can say something about the title of these poems, please do. The poet hasn't just chosen the title off the top of his head or her head. It has been very, very specifically thought of. It's like a headline in a newspaper. It needs to grab your attention. And this one, 2 words long, but has a lot of meaning in it already. Okay, so thinking about colours in this, what kind of colours would you identify as neutral? I guess you would say things like beige, cream, white, grey, and all those things are present in this poem. So there are some words in this poem which are a little bit old-fashioned because it was written in the end of the 19th century. Chidden means scolded, told off by. The sod in this case means the earth, the soil, the ground. Rove, if you rove, you wander. To wring something, written in this way with a silent W at the beginning, is like when you wring out a cloth. You're really, really twisting and turning it to get all the water out of it. So if you are metaphorically if your heart, you can wring your heart, and that means you're twisting and causing it pain, basically. So to cause distress. Okay, just a little bit about poetic form here. All of these are in this poem. So we're quite used to iambic with that didum, didum, didum heartbeat beat. But here are some other words, and I've called this an extension glossary. If you want to know a bit more about poetic meter, and you can hear that well in a poem. Some people are very adept to hearing the stressed and unstressed beats in a poem or in a word. Some people just can't hear them at all. If you're one of those people who's interested in that, here's a little glossary for you. An anapest is 2 unstressed syllables followed by 1 stress. So we would write that often like this, unstressed, stress. Like we'd write an iamb like this, dum. But an anapest is da-da-dum. And often that's quite a galloping rhythm if there's just lots of anapest, da-da-dum, 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 da-da-dum. So that's an anapest. A dactyl is exactly the opposite of that. So it's dum-da-da. Praiseworthy, for example, would be an example of a dactyl. So dum-da-da. And again, that could have almost a kind of chanting kind of rhythm, dum-da-da, 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 dum. But of course, when you have it in a row, it would almost be the same as an anapest because it is da-da-dum, 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 da-da. It's just a slight shift. Tetrameter is a line of verse containing 4 feet. So instead of pentameter, which is a line of verse containing 5 feet, now feet is one of these things. So a dactyl or an anapest or an iamb is a foot. So iambs, if you have 5 of them, that's 10 syllables, isn't it? Because each iamb is 2 syllables. So that's a pentameter. If you have 5 dactyls, it's dactylic pentameter, anapestal pentameter. However, if you have 4 feet, it's iambic tetrameter or dactylic tetrameter or whatever it is. Okay, so that would be 4 dactyls or 4 anapests or 4 iambs. Again, this is higher order vocabulary. You don't need to say this. You can just talk about rhythms and rhymes without all these words. But this is just an extension. Okay, let's get on to the poem itself. Neutral tones. So first of all, thinking about structure in neutral tones, let's look at the rhyme scheme. We have day, God, sod, grey. So it seems to be ABBA. Let's just make sure that continues throughout. Rove, ago, fro, love. Well, they're half rhymes, but yes. Thing, die, thereby, wing, yeah. Deceives, me, tree, leaves. Yes, I realise, by the way, that these aren't all A rhymes. Thing doesn't rhyme with day, but once you've done one verse, if it continues the same, you just call it an ABBA rhyme scheme. You don't need to say then C, D, D, C, and then E, F, F. It's ABBA. And everyone should know that that means the first and the last line rhyme and that there's a couplet in the middle. So these are all ABBA, quatrains. So that's our kind of technical point, but how does that link to what Hardy's trying to say in the poem? Well, once we read the poem, we can maybe talk about that. So let me read it to you. We stood by a pond that winter day, and the sun was white as though chidden of God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. They had fallen from an ash and were grey. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago, and some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing, alive enough to have strength to die, and a grin of bitterness swept thereby like an ominous bird a-wing. Since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me your face and the God-cursed sun and a tree and a pond edged with greyish leaves. Again, you see it's quite a depressing poem. So the tones of voice in this poem are, I would suggest, regret, disappointment, boredom, perhaps pain, loss. There's a lot of imagery of death, negative things, okay? If we're just looking at the neutral tones imagery of those colours, we have things that kind of link to that: winter, starving, ash, grey. And then these things are then God-cursed sun, greyish here. It's not even grey here, it's greyish. The tone has petered out even more by the end. So you have all those neutral tones in it here, but you also have those neutral tones. You may actually say, rather than neutral, this actually is quite negative. Was this a good name for it? Or is the worst thing you could say about something is that you feel nothing towards it, rather than hatred? There's just no feeling there at all. Is that actually worse? I think perhaps it is. Okay, so going back to the regular rhyme scheme, very regular rhyme scheme, of course, now we know this is a poem about tedium, boredom, negative things, love being an awful thing. You could say the regularity shows the boredom he's feeling, or the ongoing tedium of the relationship, something like that. And you can see it does have some of those Anapests in it. We stood by a pond that winter day, and the sun was white as though chidden of God. It's got those Anapests in it. So it's a little bit of a kind of that rhythm kind of is flowing through it, almost a galloping rhythm, like he wants to get on with it or get the memory out of his head. Perhaps that's how you could link it to it. Remember, don't say anything about structure that you can't link. It's pointless just to say it's got Anapests in it. You've got, even though you've used the word Anapests, you've got to link it to meaning. and talk about your interpretations. Okay, anything else about the structure? Well, there's a few end stop lines and caesuras and some bigger kind of punctuation here. The ellipsis there, creating tension like an ominous bird a wing. A bird a wing means flying, and ominous, as you know, means a bad sign, a sign that something bad's going to happen, like a bad omen. That's why ominous. So that ellipsis is tension, what bad thing is going to happen. You've got also this dash here to kind of add an explanation about the leaves. They had fallen from an ash and were grey. Why do we need that extra explanation? Is that a metaphor for something? Leaves falling from a tree, like the last remnants of love falling from someone, perhaps. So all these bits of punctuation emphasize something that the poet's trying to say. Then you've got some enjambment here, especially this bit, which, since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong. That's very alliterative there, rings with wrong, bringing attention to that word rings, that emotive word, as if your heart is being wrung out like a sponge. Have shaped to me your face. Now that enjambment there and then almost the big caesura here after your face, that's the main thing he thinks of, the main memory. Her face, the sun, that tree, and the pond with all grey leaves round it. It's a very depressing, dingy image, isn't it? Okay, so that's structure and some things you can say about it. Let's look at some language here. First of all, we don't know what he's talking about here, but obviously he's talking about a memory, an anecdote of some kind. That winter day, again, the connotations of cold, bitterness, kind of a lack of feeling, I guess. The sun was white as though chidden of God. Remember, chidden means told off. God has told off the sun and it daredn't shine. So you've got that white, really pale sun. Again, the neutral tone, but suggesting coldness, a lack of feeling, a lack of heat. A few leaves lay on the starving sod. This personification here of the earth being starving. It wants something, it needs something, like somebody needs love and it's not being provided to it. And we've already talked about they had fallen from an ash and were grey. Even the word ash, I mean, it is the name of a tree, but it's also a colour, isn't it? A very greyish pale colour. So perhaps chosen symbolically because of that as well. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago. So the way that she's looking at him is the way that she used to just look at some boring kind of problem. Again, it's a negative image of boredom and frustration. A riddle is something you can't work out. I'm so sorry about the pen. And some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. They're talking very little, but you've got the personification here of the words playing between them. Now you might think that's a more positive image of playing. Words playing, but it's like a game, like a mind game. It's nothing real, it's nothing sincere. Insincere, I'm going to put. Everything's just a game. This is probably my favourite verse, just because of its complete kind of condemnation. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing. You've got a superlative here, deadest. Superlative, the most you can get of anything, deadest. But even worse, it was just alive enough to have the strength to die. It's not like she wasn't smiling. It's like she had a smile and then the smile just left her, which is even worse again, isn't it? So this is a very strong image here of just a complete loss of hope, I would say. You might say hatred, you might say bitterness, any of those things. Again, it's obviously a metaphor, so it's personification, personifying the smile as a living thing in itself, just the smile. And then he turns smile to grin, which has negative connotations, doesn't it, of evil. So the smile dies and becomes a grin of bitterness, swept thereby. That word there, it was quick and fleeting, but it was enough. Like an ominous bird a wing. Simile here. The grin on her face is like when a bird flies overhead and it's a bad omen. You say that's bad luck. And then the last verse, since then, so this is the memory in the first 3 verses, and then we come almost full circle here. It's almost circular because he ends very much as he begins, but there are differences. So it's almost a circular structure. That again is to do with structure. Since then, so he tells us that was the past. Keen lessons. Now this means sharp. Like your knife's edge can be keen and sharp. Doesn't mean keen as in wanting to do things. Keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong. So since then, he's had a lot of bad luck in love. All he knows about love, this poet, is that it deceives and it hurts you. So Hardy's view of love is painful and deceptive. And again, I talked about the alliteration there to really bring out those words, rings with wrong. So since that horrible memory, I've had other lessons that have taught me that love is nothing but deceitful and nothing but horrible and painful. And all those lessons, every time I had them, it made me think of this time. So every time something bad happened to me, I thought of this one time as well. So they've shaped to me your face and the God-cursed sun. God told off the sun here, but now he's cursing it. That's even worse. So things have got worse by the end of this poem. And a tree and a pond edged with greyish leaves. Greyish, like I said, even the tone has dissipated even more, even paler, more remote of a memory. But this is the bit really, every lesson he's ever had that in love that has taught him that love is bad, every heartbreak he's ever had makes him think of that person. Your face is the one I see. So it's a depressing poem, it's a bitter poem, it's a poem that love is nothing but pain, it deceives you, nothing good can ever come of it. It reminds him of this horrible winter's day by the pond where they were unsmiling, where they hardly talked to each other, and where everything was pale and grey and hopeless. So thank you, Mr. Hardy, for that poem. But it's a very good one because it's fairly short. There's some really good quotes in there that you can talk about and good techniques. And it's well compared to other poems. Perhaps poems such as One Flesh, which has a much more positive view of a long-term love affair. Perhaps also Sonnet 43, which is How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways, completely different in tone to this one. There's lots that you can compare it to, but I hope that's given you a bit more insight into the poem Neutral Tones.